Hello friends, welcome to CEC live lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we are going to talk on Marxist theory of the Indian state. Dear friends, in the previous session also we discussed this particular topic in detail and we discussed on the positioning of the parties, whereas in this session today we are going to discuss more on academic discourse of Marxist theory of Indian state. And for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is Associate Professor and he is teaching in the Department of Political Science, Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is a dynamic professor and we believe that you always get in-depth knowledge through him on various topics of political science. Friends, if you wish to ask questions from Dr. Satish Kumar Jha on today's topic, then do call us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1800110430. I repeat, our number is 1800110430. Now, I would like to request Dr. Satish Kumar Jha to explain us in detail the Marxist theory of Indian state in context to the academic discourse. Hello sir, welcome to the lecture.
Thank you Geetika ji and good afternoon. Today is the second part of our discussion on Marxist theory of Indian state, and what we will be doing in the remaining time that we will be focusing on that how the academic discourse in India, particularly from the standpoint of Marxism, has looked at this entire nature and character of Indian state. In the first part of our discussion, we had dealt with 2-3 important issues related to this topic. Number one, that how Marxism or Marxist ideology or Marxist theory looks at the state institutions and state power. And in that context, we had basically extensively discussed the theoretical construct within Marxism so far as state and state institutions are concerned. But at the same time, we also looked at the two different ways through which this entire nature and character of a state is discussed within Marxist theory. One which I put it as an instrumentalist approach, which looks at a state nothing as the managing committee of the bourgeoisie, and I mentioned that this is nothing but a communist manifesto view of the state power and state institutions, which basically talked about a state as the managing committee of the bourgeoisie. And it is this instrumentalist perspective within Marxism which has largely influenced the practicing the communist ideologues and the communist parties as well, including some of the the political formations in India who subscribe to this Marxist ideology, including CPI, Communist Party of India, CPI-M, and various factions of CPI-ML. They also perhaps explained Indian state by using this instrumentalist perspective of Marxism. This is what I discussed in our first part of our discussion. But at the same time, I also mentioned that in Marx himself, there is alternative or one can say there is another way to look at this entire issue, and that is what is presented as a relative autonomy perspective on the state. What is this relative autonomy? I had tried to explain in my last lecture. I mentioned that Karl Marx himself, in his very famous piece of writing 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, particularly in context of the French situation, explained that how under certain situations, circumstances, a state attains autonomy from the dominant interest and dominant classes or the ruling class, and that autonomy is of course relative, but nonetheless that autonomy is necessitated by certain historical situation, and those situations are explained in 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, that piece of writing of Karl Marx. And I had explained that what are those conditions when class struggle freezes, when there is no class in a position to wield state power, and so on and so forth, and therefore what happens that a state attains autonomy. But at the same time, I also mentioned that though a state attains autonomy, but unlike the liberal theory which perhaps gives full autonomy to a state, Marxist theory does not give full autonomy, rather it gives relative autonomy. Relative in the sense that it is autonomous from the dominant class. It does not work at the behest of any particular class, but nonetheless it acts on behalf of the entire ruling section, or on behalf of the structure of capitalism, or one can say the structural logic of the society. that is the base. So, whatever structural logic prevails, the state does not go against it, but nonetheless as a temporary measure in order to serve the larger interest or long term interest, what it does that it attains a relative autonomy. So, this is how he looked at this question of relative autonomy of a state. Now, I mentioned that this theory of course has been used by many Marxist scholars in India, and they have basically looked at Indian state through this framework of relative autonomy, instead of simply reducing it to particular class interest or a combination of class interests, or providing an instrumentalist understanding of Indian state the way the communist parties of India, various communist parties perhaps looked at it. So, this is how a major difference I located in terms of the academic approach on the nature of Indian state from the point of view of Marxist theory and the party line. One can say that how the various political parties drawing on a Marxist writing or Marxist ideology have looked at this question. But at the same time, I also pointed out that even within the academic approach or among the scholars with having Marxist orientation, what we find that there are two types one can always figure out. One is also among academicians, scholars or social science discourse, there is an instrumentalist view, but at the same time there is also a very important relative autonomy view within this Marxist academic discourse. Now, this instrumentalist view I mentioned in my last lecture is normally associated with the writings of A.R. Desai, Ajit Roy, Paresh Chattopadhyay and few other scholars who basically try to explain Indian state and nature and character of Indian state in the same way perhaps the various communist parties in India tried to explain, using perhaps the classical orthodox Marxist line or position that state has to act on the behalf or at the behest of the ruling class. It cannot do anything else. There cannot be any other way to look at it, and therefore Indian state also was seen acting at the in the similar fashion, serving the interest of the bourgeoisie, the big bourgeoisie, the national bourgeoisie, the comprador bourgeoisie, that is the international bourgeoisie or the international capital, and so on and so forth. Later on, of course, the rich peasants, the kulaks after agrarian particularly green revolution. So, this was the understanding, the instrumentalist understanding developed by scholars like A.R. Desai and Ajit Roy and Paresh Chattopadhyay and many others, and one can put it broadly as orthodox understanding within academic discourse, like perhaps the communist parties who were doing it earlier. Now, but one thing we should remember, that this instrumentalist view which was dominant for a long period of time, perhaps one can say till 70s, till the time this a alternative perspective emerged and surfaced within Marxist theory. So, far as Indian state analysis and explanation of Indian state is concerned, and this approach was not only dominant, but this was the only approach coming from the academic world, be it A.R. Desai, Ajit Roy, Paresh Chattopadhyay, or perhaps that famous piece or one can say that edited book which was produced by Kathleen Gough and Hari Prasad Sharma in 70s. So, these were the only way in which perhaps the Marxist theory in academia was perhaps seen to be doing this analysis of Indian state. But what happened, that gradually an alternative perspective started emerging, and one can say that this alternative perspective not only in 70s, because 70s became more visible with the writings of scholars like Sudipta Kaviraj, one can say Pranab Bardhan, in fact Matthew Kurian, Shrikant Dutt, Partha Chatterjee. Though I mentioned in my last lecture also that Partha Chatterjee's writings have perhaps evolved in different phases. Earlier phase, of course, he talked about the coalitional logic of capitalism in India and the coalitional logic of the ruling class in India, but later on perhaps he modified his view, and he basically thought that in post economic reform era in India, that is post 1991, this entire understanding of Indian state, even from the point of view of the Marxist theory, needs modification, and accordingly he has come out with his own classification, which we will be discussing later. So what in fact I find that this alternative perspective started developing, and there were two important sources of this alternative perspective. Of course, one was this coming from Gramsci and Althusser, the two eminent Marxist philosophers. Althusser, the German philosopher, French philosopher, Althusser, and this Gramsci, the Italian Marxist philosopher. And what happened that both of them produce a new understanding of Marxism through their writings, and the two different conceptual frameworks which they offered, that is the concept of over-determination of Althusser, and a concept of hegemony and passive revolution, perhaps given by Antonio Gramsci. So, some of the Indian Marxist scholars started relying on these later developments within Marxist theory in the West, and they started looking at Indian state by using this theoretical framework. Now, of course, one thing we should remember, that was the one source for this development of an alternative understanding of nature and character of Indian state. But there was another source, and that was coming from Kalecki. And here, in fact, I mentioned in my last lecture also that K.N. Raj, one of the very one of the eminent Indian economists, drawing on the writings and ideas of Kalecki, talked about intermediate regime. That how there are countries which could be characterized as neither capitalism nor socialism, but falling in category of intermediate regime, and in those intermediate regimes, how the state institutions and state power could be seen to be working and operating. So, therefore, another source was Kalecki, and here I had mentioned also Charles Bethlehem's and of this entire argument about state capitalism and so on and so forth. So, therefore, we find that there were two sources through which this alternative perspective was developing gradually, so far as the understanding of Indian state is concerned. So, before I move to this Althusser Gramscian framework operationalized in India by people like Kaviraj and others, we should have also a look at K.N. Raj's contribution, particularly his understanding of intermediate regime, drawing on Kalecki, that what were the arguments in support of this intermediate regime. But along with these scholars, Pranab Bardhan, particularly after the publication of his book Political Economy of Development in India, we find that he also used this relative autonomy argument, but of course drawing on multiple sources, along with of course these sources which I have already cited within Marxism, also perhaps other coalitional models which were developing in comparative politics and political economy. So therefore, Pranab Bardhan's writing also was a major intervention so far as this entire debate and discussion on the nature and character of Indian state is concerned. So therefore, we find that this academic discourse or academic intervention, particularly later academic intervention in 60s and 70s, enriched this entire debate and discourse on the Marxist theory of Indian state. Unlike the earlier years, where it was mostly dominated by party ideologues, party lines, or one can say that orthodox classical Marxist interpretation, which was largely influenced by the CPSU, Communist Party of Soviet Union, and their positioning and their interpretation, and so on, and many other things. But we should remember one thing I had mentioned, that the communist parties also did not remain fixed in terms of their analysis. They later on modified it, and therefore I mentioned that India's Communist Party perhaps was the first communist party in the world which came to power through parliamentary means, particularly in Kerala, when the Communist Party of India formed a government, and later on witnessed many splits within its ranks, largely on account of its varying interpretation of Indian state, the nature of ruling class, which extensively we discussed in the first part of our discussion, that how Communist Party of India explained this ruling class in India, how the Communist Party of India Marxist CPI-M explained it and differed with CPI, and later on within CPI-M there was another split when the Communist Party of India Marxist Leninists came out because of the differences in their opinion and interpretations. So therefore, what we find that these debates were also going on, and some of course the reasons I had also mentioned in my last lecture, that CPSU itself started changing its position after emergence of Khrushchev, and also mentioned that how this global split within the international communist movement between China and Soviet Union, erstwhile Soviet Union, also was responsible for this varying interpretations or contestations or the differences which surfaced within various communist parties in India. So this part we had touched in our last discussion, but this academic part, what I was mentioning earlier today, that this academic discussion or academic discourse had enriched this entire Marxist theory of Indian state, enriched in many ways, because what happened that when the communist parties were basically caught in a peculiar dilemma, they were not in a position to modify their position or their line, ideological line, largely on account of the dictates of CPSU, and also on account of their inability to factorize many specific Indian factors which were influencing the operational logic of the state power, be it culture, be it religion, be it caste, or the kind of economic development which was taking place here during Nehru's years, which could not be explained purely in the classical capitalist framework or under the state socialism which was developing in Soviet Union and China, but nonetheless they were not being able to explain it or basically properly comprehend it. Later on, of course, they started realizing the autonomy of Indian model of economic development, particularly after they discovered that the size of state sector was growing, it was curbing private capital, it was attaining autonomy from the global capitalism through its non-aligned foreign policy and many other factors. So the Communist Party started changing its position along with the changes which were basically being done at the level of the CPSU, particularly after ascendancy of Khrushchev. But the academicians, the scholars, the social scientists from the beginning were quite alive to this reality, and therefore they were open to new explanations. They were open to new ideas. They were in fact ready to accommodate a new understanding if it helped them in comprehending nature and character of a state, which is a very important aspect within Marxist theory, be it India or any society. So therefore, there was some sort of newness. One can say that they offered a more refreshing, well nuanced, and more imaginative explanation and understanding compared to the party ideologues, or one can say that orthodox academic line which was given by A.R. Desai and many others, which did not differ much with the party line, because they also use the same instrumentalist logic. So therefore, this thing we should remember, that how this has enriched this entire academic intervention from the standpoint of Marxism has enriched our understanding of Indian state over the years in last 7 decades, and particularly 60s and 70s, when I mentioned that this relative autonomy perspective was becoming dominant with K.N. Raj's intermediate regime, Sudit Kaviraj's passive revolution, Pranab Bardhan's coalitional logic of the ruling class, and many other similar writings, we find that it opened altogether a new vistas so far as the understanding of Indian politics is concerned. But at the same time, I should also mention here that these writings were mostly in 60s and 70s. 60s, particularly after Green Revolution took place. 60s after this transition from Nehruvian era, that is Nehru Mahalanobis discourse as it is mentioned, to a period which is perhaps associated with Mrs. Indira Gandhi, particularly as it is called license permit Raj, and perhaps the kind of regulatory state over regulated state and law came into existence, and and subsequently in 70s when we witnessed a lot of populist politics from the standpoint of left, or one can say the left populism, be it Garibi Hatao, abolition of privy purses and many other things, and subsequently the rise of authoritarian politics, particularly the hallmark of that period was of course the promulgation of emergency in 75. So, therefore, this authoritarianism of a state which came into existence, and therefore, what happened that most of these explanations tried to capture those moments in history, particularly in post colonial period, and then they tried to use the Marxian insights that how those moments could be explained through Marxist theory and Marxist explanation. And it is in this context that Sudip Kaviraj's concept of passive revolution became very important. But what happened that after 70s, particularly in early 80s, when the process of liberalization started, though normally in common discourse it is basically seen that liberalization is associated with post 1991 economic reforms in India. But there is no denying the fact that liberalization at a large scale started in 1991. But we should also remember that the seeds of liberalization were sown early on, particularly in 1980, and the return of Mrs. Indira Gandhi to power, particularly after Janata Party government was replaced by Mrs. Indira Gandhi in 1980s midterm poll, and 1980 onwards we have seen that this process of liberalization started, and it was accelerated further by Mr. Rajiv Gandhi in 1984-85 when he became India's Prime Minister. Of course, this entire process got a new boost with Narasimha Raw's celebrated economic reforms of 1991 with Manmohan Singh as the finance minister, the architect of this entire reform era. So, therefore, what happened, this liberalization which started in 80 and economic reforms which not only included liberalization, but it included few more things: structural adjustment, globalization, privatization and many other things as a package. So, what happened that post 91 one can say that the changes which have transformed Indian economy, Indian society, the character of India's dominant classes, in Marxist parlance one can say the ruling class, and also the state institutions. These perhaps changes have not been captured by the kind of explanations which were offered either by K. N. Raj through his intermediate regime, or Sudip Kaviraj by his passive revolution, or many other scholars who tried to use relative autonomy or similar other conceptualizations in late 60s and early 70s. How this has happened, and it is in this context I was mentioning that Partha Chatterjee's argument holds good. Partha Chatterjee says that Sudip Kaviraj's passive revolution is a very helpful conceptual tool to understand Indian politics from the point of view of Marxist theory of 60s and 70s, the Green Revolution, the license permit Raj, authoritarianism of emergency type and so many other things, but not the reform era. And it is in this context that he claims that his categorization or his argument, particularly the way Partha Chatterjee has come out with series of writings in 90s and tried to capture these moments, particularly the transformation of the reform era. He says that they are better equipped to explain these transformations than perhaps the category of passive revolution or coalitional politics of the earlier eras given by other Marxist scholars. So, Partha Chatterjee's claim also has to be tested, particularly his entire theoretical construct of political society and civil society, the binary which he creates, because he said that unlike classical capitalist societies. India doesn't have a civil society, and therefore India's civil society is to be seen as standing side by another society which he calls political society, and civil society is the society which is characterized by modernity, whereas the political society is society which is characterized by democracy. So, modernity and democracy binaries he creates through this, and then he tries to explain the politics of the governed. That is perhaps the title of his book also. So, therefore, one has to see that how someone like Partha Chatterjee, who earlier was operationalizing Althusserian structural explanation of Indian state by subscribing to this Marxist theory, later on has modified his view and says that it is largely on account of the transformation of Indian economy, society and politics. So, therefore, whether these transformations are captured by these conceptual tools or still they defy it. If they defy it, then how the Marxist theory perhaps has to come to terms with the changes in Indian politics in last 7 decades is a big challenge. The communist parties are struggling to come to terms with these changes, and therefore one can say they are in a state of terminal decline. Their social base is shrinking. They are losing state after state, particularly in those states where they were ruling for number of years. So, parties are struggling to come to terms with these changes. Party ideologues are also struggling to deal with number of changes which have taken place in India, and the academic discourse, particularly the academicians or the Marxist scholars who are also reflecting on this issue, they are also perhaps not being able to convincingly provide they are not being able to provide a convincing explanation. So, you have to see all these things that how the Marxist theory of Indian state is to be understood today in light of 7 decades of experience and the 7 decades of explanations and debates and discussions.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us this session. Friends, you are requested to be with us as we are back after a short break. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Friends, as you know that today we are talking on Marxist theory of Indian state, and we are taking academic discourse today. For the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is Associate Professor in Department of Political Science, Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi. Friends, if you wish to ask questions from Dr. Satish Kumar Jha on today's topic, then do call us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1800110430. I repeat, our number is 1800110430. Now, I would like to request Dr. Satish Kumar Jha to carry the session forward. Hello, sir. Welcome back to the session.
Thank you. In fact, in our earlier section, we were discussing that how the Marxist theory of Indian state is to be understood in light of the contributions of both the party ideologues and the Marxist theoreticians and Marxist scholars in India. In that context, I was also mentioning that it is not a very homogeneous corpus of ideas or writings. There are different perspectives within it, though most of them subscribe to the Marxism as an ideology and Marxism as a theoretical framework. But nonetheless, drawing on Marx's writings, they are basically divided into a number of camps, and the two camps which I identified on particularly the state and nature of a state. One is the instrumentalist, another is the relative autonomist. In comparative politics, there was a time when there was a very heated exchange on this instrumentalist and autonomist relative autonomy issue between Miliband and Pollingers in the West, and that debate is a celebrated debate in comparative politics. Pollingers, as a disciple of Althusser, arguing for relative autonomy, whereas Miliband perhaps arguing for that instrumentalist view. So that is there in comparative politics. In India, I also mentioned that this relative autonomy debate was opened up, and number of scholars have contributed in this field. In fact, it started with Pranab Bardhan, it started with Partha Chatterjee, started with Sudip Kaviraj, Hamza Alavi, who was essentially a scholar working on Pakistan, but nonetheless he also reflected on India. Or one can say Anupam Sen, a scholar who was working on Pakistan, Bangladesh and India. So in fact, these scholars perhaps enriched our understanding of, or one can say that enriched the ways through which we could understand Indian state. Hamza Alavi's position in fact was little bit different. He was saying that India has inherited a state institutions and a state power, or one can say that superstructural realm in India has from the very beginning has been more developed than perhaps its base superstructure. Base superstructure distinction within Marxist theory. So therefore, because the superstructure is epiphenomenal and it has to basically serve the logic of the base, but he argued that here the superstructure was so overdeveloped that the base became subservient, rather superstructure became more important and dominant, and therefore that was one of the reasons that he gave autonomy, relative autonomy to a state vis-a-vis the base, that is economic base, the mode of production, or one can say the dominant class or the ruling class. This was Hamza Alavi, but then there were other scholars who were arguing with a different set of reasons, with a different set of arguments, and in that context I mentioned that a number of sources came to influence this new genre of writing, but the two important sources or three important sources, one was Kalecki, particularly operationalized by economist K. N. Raj, another was Gramsci, particularly the way his concept of passive revolution and historic bloc or ruling bloc was operationalized by Kaviraj, Chatterjee and others, and then of course Pranab Bardhan, who talked of relative autonomy of a state by citing number of reasons. So therefore 2-3 different sources of influence one could find out. So before I deal with some of these positions, and then I mentioned in my last section that Partha Chatterjee's argument has to be taken seriously, because he says that most of these Marxist explanations were product of 60s and 70s of Indian politics, because the 60s and 70s were characterized by a different set of economic and political developments, but the 80s and 90s threw different challenge. 90s particularly was characterized by economic reforms, and therefore what has happened that these moments have not been adequately captured by these theoretical constructions or theoretical constructs or the arguments which are to be associated with these scholars. So therefore he claims that his writings are trying to come to terms with the changes of 90s, and at the same time he also says that this entire Marxist understanding, be it Althusserian or Gramscian, need to be little bit modified in the present context, and where he perhaps draws on many the postmodernist and the post structuralist arguments. So therefore this is something we have to see also in context of this Marxist theory of Indian state. But one thing we should remember, that any discussion of Marxist theory of a state would remain incomplete and inadequate unless a proper discussion of social formation and mode of production are done. And accordingly we find that the Indian scholars in fact started their entire debate with this debate on mode of production and social formation. Initially it was in context of Asiatic mode of production debate, as in light of Marx's own formulation of Asiatic mode of production, because he himself argued that these Asian countries including India did not fit into his classification of historical evolution, and therefore these societies are to be seen differently, kind of exceptionalism which he made for these societies, and that he put in form of Asiatic mode of production, that these mode of productions or mode of productions in these societies were different from the Western societies in terms of the nature of class formation. And this Asiatic mode of production is extensively debated within Marxist theory, because Marx argued that in a country like India there were some specific reasons to believe that this entire Western category of class would not be applicable in the same form. One is of course the category of caste, a very important category, and number two, the kind of role which state played from the very beginning in the development of these societies, particularly the autonomous village republics, the closed societies at the bottom, and the closed largely on account of the caste system, hierarchical order and so on and so forth, and at the top a very powerful state structure, and therefore the relationship between two was mediated in a very different manner compared to what normally we find in the Western societies. So therefore he argued that it was an Asiatic mode of production, and the appropriation of surplus, which is a very important tool to understand the formation of classes in Marxist theory. He argued that the appropriation of surplus in these societies was not done through class, but rather through the political structure of state, and therefore the surplus was appropriated by state and was retained by the state. So instead of the ruling class or the dominant class or the class relations between the producer and appropriator of surplus, here you had a different type of relationship, and that relationship was the relationship between the state and the producer or the classes at the bottom. So therefore what happened, that this offered a different type of situation, but later on many Marxist historians debated this issue, and they argued that Marx had limited access to the historical evidences from India, and therefore perhaps he came to this conclusion, but nonetheless the Marxian method, Marxian classification could be applied to these societies, and therefore we know that there are a lot of debate in India on this transition debate, Aram Sharan Sharma and many other so they have debated this issue. This is known as feudalism debate, that India also had a feudal moment. India also had a feudal society like the West, and they perhaps cite the example of the land grant which was made in ancient period, particularly early medieval and late ancient period, and how that land grant created a kind of feudal structure and so on and so forth. So therefore this Asiatic mode of production issue was debated by historians. In fact this is there. Then we find that in post independent period, and I mentioned earlier also in my last lecture, the mode of production debate happened. because for Marxism it becomes important to establish first the nature and character of a mode of production of society, because only after that the character of or nature of social formation could be decided. So, therefore, a mode of production debate started. It started on the basis of economic and political weekly, and the scholars mostly of Marxist persuasion they joined this debate. Ashok Rudra, Utsa Patnaik, Nirmal Chandra, Jairus Banaji, P.H. Prasad and many others, their positions also differed. On the one hand, from declaring India to be moving towards capitalism to semi-capitalism to feudalism to semi-feudalism, there are number of characterizations which were made through this debate, that neither some of the scholars argued, like Utsa Patnaik argued, that in agriculture, particularly in 60s, capitalism was growing in agriculture. A similar line which perhaps Francis Frankel, a pluralist liberal scholar, also perhaps did later, but Utsa Patnaik tried to establish that how capitalism was developing in agriculture. Some others like Ashok Rudra also tried to develop the similar argument, whereas many others tried to argue about semi-feudalism, or semi-capitalism. So, this semi-category became very prominent in this debate. So, therefore, this mode of production debate became a very celebrated debate within Marxist theory, so far as the nature of social formation and nature of mode of production is concerned. Now, what happened that this mode of production debate, when one talks of, one is reminded of a very celebrated writing of 60s of Barrington Moore Jr., particularly the social origin of dictatorship and democracy and the role of lords and peasants in history. This book perhaps tried to explain the rise of democracy in different societies, and also perhaps tried to come to terms with this thing that why democracy could not develop in some other societies, why it developed in some societies whereas it did not develop in other societies. And the societies which were discussed by Barrington Moore Jr. Were the classical land of democracy and capitalism, France, Britain, United States of America, and also at the same time discuss Soviet Union and China, and two aberrant case, that is Germany and Italy. And the Barrington Moore tried to explain that why capitalism developed in France, Britain and USA, why it didn't develop in Germany and Italy, and why it was sought to be developed through a state, or one can say capitalism from above, and how this authoritarianism or fascism and Nazism developed in these societies in process of development of capitalism. So, one argument which Barrington Moore prominently put forth was that no bourgeoisie, no democracy. If you do not have bourgeois class, you should not think of democracy. That means that for democracy, the presence of bourgeoisie or the role of bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, is important. Interestingly, United States of America did not have the bourgeoisie like France and Britain. It had a commercial class, but nonetheless it also developed democracy. So, what happened, that this is one. Secondly, that how peasants issue are resolved, that is also important for democracy. How peasant question is tackled, and he explains that in Britain and many other countries it was tackled through enclosure movement and many other similar means through which the primitive accumulation was done for industrial development. In Soviet Union and China, this issue was tackled through collectivization or the forced liquidation of peasantry. Now, what I am mentioning, that on the one hand Barrington Moore makes a distinction between the countries where the democracy developed, particularly because of the presence of the bourgeoisie, kind of the class combinations which existed at the bottom, and that promoted capitalism and therefore ultimately promoted democracy. Where this combination did not exist, like Germany and Italy, it led to fascism and Nazism, because capitalism was sought to be developed through the state institutions, and this is perhaps what Gramsci also tried to explain through his concept of passive revolution, which has been operationalized by some Marxist scholars in India. And then in fact Barrington Moore in fact talks about India as well, and that is why his writing is important. Now of course in Indian context he says that neither the peasant question was settled here the way it was settled in Western democracies, nor it was settled the way perhaps it was settled in socialist societies or the communist societies like Soviet Union and China. Peasants continued to exist, and the continuance of the peasantry was a puzzle and the survival of democracy. So, the no bourgeoisie, no democracy argument on the one hand, and on the other hand the settlement of peasant question, these two important messages which come from this book of Barrington Moore Jr. In India he says that on the one hand you cannot have a classical capitalism, classical bourgeois revolution, therefore no bourgeoisie the way perhaps it could be seen in Western societies. On the other hand, the settlement of peasant question was also not done. Peasants continued to exist, and therefore and at the same time the democratic institutions continued to grow, democratic process continued to take place. So therefore this was the puzzle, and Barrington Moore Jr. tried to explain this thing with a reference to Indian middle class, particularly India's national movement, particularly Indian National Congress, the way perhaps it created the roots of democracy and so on and so forth. So what I was trying to mention through Barrington Moore Jr., that this nature of Indian social formation, uniqueness of India's social formation has not only puzzled the Marxist scholars in India, but it has also puzzled scholars world over, and Barrington Moore Jr. book is perhaps the best example of this puzzle. So what has happened that the Indian Marxist scholars, in order to explain and analyze Indian state, have been looking at this question of mode of production and transition very seriously, and therefore these debates reflect those concerns. Now coming to this the explanation by scholars, particularly the alternative explanation, not the instrumentalist one, which I mentioned come from K. N. Raj and many others. Let us start with the K. N. Raj first. Particularly it is a very important intervention in 60s by a very eminent Indian political economist. Now that is the concept of intermediate regime. As I mentioned that he draws on the writings of Kaleki, and while drawing on Kaleki's writing, in fact he mentions 2-3 things that why India could be considered intermediate regime. In fact K. N. Raj believed that a state particularly was playing at that time when he was writing and who he was explaining a very dynamic role, or one can say that it was playing the role of a dynamic entrepreneur, and therefore the economic development in fact was the amalgamation of the interest of the lower middle classes with the state capitalism. This is something very interesting to see in K. N. Raj's writing. He also mentions 3-4 factors, set of factors in support of this intermediate regime, that these societies could neither be seen as a purely capitalist or the socialist societies, but as intermediate regime, as the formulation of Kaleki perhaps also believed. First is the public sector, the mammoth size of the public sector in India, the kind of welfare role which the public sector was playing. Secondly, the vast middle sector, and in fact he believed that this middle sector eventually will become the base for capitalism and would ultimately pave the way for socialism. Similarly, K. N. Raj also talked of a different type of class coalition in this intermediate regime. He found a combination or coalition of lower middle class and the rich peasants as the ruling class. The lower middle class, in his opinion, included a small propertied class in agriculture, industry, commerce, and the professionals like doctors, lawyers, bureaucrats, and so on and so forth. And therefore he believed that this was the nature of in fact the ruling class in India. Interestingly, including these professionals as a ruling class later on was also argued and developed by Ashok Rudra and many others, A.K. Bagchi and others. So, therefore, this is something we find coming from this Ken Ross so far as this intermediate regime is concerned. Now, he believed that in this intermediate regime a state was playing a very different role, and the favorable conditions for the state to play this different role according to Ken Ross were provided by the numerical dominance of the lower middle class at home, particularly at the time of independence. The number 2, the involvement of a state in economic activities, and number 3, availability of the credit from the socialist countries, because one thing we should remember that this was the era of Cold War, and the kind of subsidized credit which was coming from socialist societies, socialist countries like Soviet Union. So, therefore, he believed that these 3 things played important role for the state playing a different role, and the favorable conditions were largely on account of these factors. So, therefore, in fact Ken Ross argues that the kind of independence which the state perhaps enjoyed from foreign capital, in particularly carrying land reforms and continuing economic growth, particularly in Nehruvian era and the post Nehruvian era, was largely an account of number of factors, and therefore, he believed that Indian state could not be characterized purely as a capitalist state or perhaps a landlord state, the way perhaps the communist parties of India were doing at that point of time. And therefore, the nature of ruling class, he believed, was also coalitional in logic, and therefore, this lower middle class rich peasants, they were the the ruling class in these intermediate regimes. So, therefore, this is the kind of perhaps argument he put forth, and it became the beginning of a new understanding in academia, in the social science discourse, perhaps moving away from this instrumentalist position, which was spearheaded by party ideologues and orthodox intellectuals with the Marxist leaning. So, therefore, this was the first important academic intervention at that time, so far as the Marxist theory of Indian state is concerned. Now, Pranab Bardhan, before I move to Sudip Kaviraj, Partha Chatterjee and others, Alavi, Hamza Alavi and Pranab Bardhan need also some mention, along with Achin Binayak, particularly his book The Painful Transition, particularly the book which was published in 1990 before this era of economic reform was initiated. Alavi, I have already mentioned that how he talked about the overdeveloped superstructure in India, largely because of historical antecedents. Bardhan, a book that is Political Economy of Development, offered a new perspective in 80s, particularly when he argued that a state in India was the largest deployer of capital, and therefore, a state has developed a will of its own. It transgresses all conflicts, and therefore, it exists at a height which is perhaps above the sectional class interests. And of course, in this process, Bardhan argued that a state attains autonomy. Of course, it is relative autonomy, not the complete autonomy as perhaps the liberal theory would like it to give. So, therefore, in fact, this is Pranab Bardhan. Now, of course, one thing we should remember that Bardhan makes a distinction between 60s and 70s. In fact, he argues that till 60s a state attained more autonomy, and in 70s perhaps this autonomy got diminished, and in 70s whatever autonomy the state enjoyed was only getting reflected in its regulatory role, perhaps then in the developmental role which was perhaps seen earlier in 60s. And reasons for this decline of this autonomy in 70s, so far as in developmental role is concerned, Bardhan assigns 3 important reasons for this. First is the decline in the legitimacy of leaders of earlier eras. Number 2, the failure in the economic field. Number of instances of failure could be cited in 60s, and therefore, that was perhaps the another reason. And the third was the constraints imposed on this entire process by the dominant ruling class. So, therefore, according to Bardhan, this autonomy of course is to be seen in terms of two different eras, 60s and 70s. 70s autonomy more in regulatory function than developmental function, and in 60s autonomy perhaps more in and developmental function. So, this is Pranab Bardhan. Now, of course, the two important set of writings and approaches which perhaps took this entire Marxist theory of Indian state to new height, that is Sudip Kaviraj, Partha Chatterjee, and along with this Achin Binayak and others also have to be discussed, because this would give us a more holistic perspective that how the Marxist theory tries to, or Marxist approach tries to build theory of Indian state in a more comprehensive manner. So, therefore, these things will be discussed in the next part of our discussion.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for giving us this session on Marxist theory of Indian state. Dear friends, if you wish to give your feedback for this particular lecture, then do write to us at info.cec@nic.in. We are going to meet again soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.